We've all come across psychedelic portrayals in popular media. From horror films like Midsommar and Enter the Void to the optimism of How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, references are abundant in film, music, and other art forms. But how do psychedelics in popular media reflect and shape dominant cultural narratives? And how do these portrayals borrow from or distort traditional religious and mystical language? Hello and welcome to the integration session where we explore the science, stories, and future of psychedelics. My guest today is PhD student Nathan Keele-Springer, a PhD student in religious studies at the University of Ottawa. Nathan's work sits at the intersection of psychedelics, religion, and pop culture, including how altered states can be interpreted through religious frameworks, the grammar and language of psychedelic experiences, and how popular media reflects and shapes society, even across shifting cultural narratives. Let's dive into it. Hi, Nathan. Welcome to the Integration Session podcast. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Elena. Happy to be here.
Of course. So you're a second year PhD student in religious studies at the University of Ottawa. So I want to start by asking what drew you to religious studies as a focus, and when did psychedelics and your interest in that kind of enter the picture?
There's a few pieces of that. I think as far as the religious studies thing, a little bit prior to COVID, maybe like 2019, I was just feeling a little aimless, I guess, because I had done undergrad and then took a long break and was kind of like playing music and just focusing on other things. But I wanted to go back to school, and I was considering psychology. And I signed up for these 4 post-baccalaureate classes. 2 of them were psychology, 2 were religious studies. I ended up dropping the psychology courses and then immediately got pulled in because I had a mysticism class. So my professor, Jonathan Herman at Georgia State University, was awesome. And through the mysticism thing, I got pulled into an MA program there. And I had a long period where I didn't. Around like 2009 to 2012, I was very interested in psychedelics and was keeping up with it and did a lot of reading and just spent a lot of time thinking about them. And then there was a period between 2012 or 2011 and when How to Change Your Mind came out that I wasn't thinking about it at all. And that book came out. And another author that I like that was a fiction author had a book that came out about healing and psychedelics. And so in the program at Georgia State, I had a class, and I asked if I could write a paper in probably 2020, fall of 2020. I asked if I could write a paper about psilocybin, and I thought it was still kind of like taboo or something. And the professor really encouraged me to write the paper, then encouraged me to turn that into my master's thesis, and then it kind of just rolled from there. So, yeah.
That's really cool. Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned like the media piece, like How to Change Your Mind and different books and pieces of work that we'll touch on later, because I know you also have an interest in like the pop culture and the media aspects of psychedelics. So I think it's cool that that sort of was the beginning of your journey. And you also are the organizer of a monthly speaker series called Psychedelically Speaking. I love that name. So can you tell us a bit about the origin of that series? How did that sort of come about?
Yeah, well, I started studying here in Ottawa in fall of 2024, and pretty much right away I met a friend and colleague, Reed Barber, who's also in the religious studies program here, and he was cooking up some ideas for like what kind of became this Society for the Advancement of Psychonautic Studies thing, which really the main thing he has done with that so far, or both of us have done, is the speaker series. And at that same time that he was kind of trying to think of ways to get conversations started, my supervisor and kind of the lead of the Psychedelics and Spirituality initiative here, Anne Vallely, she at the same time was saying she wanted to start a speaker series. So those two things kind of happened at the same time, and then it just like, it just happened from there. And it's been great because it's just an excuse to, reach out to people that we really admire their work, or, people who are not familiar with their work, all kinds of different perspectives. Like we want to get, across the whole spectrum, speakers in. Yeah.
And is that available to people outside of Ottawa, as well? Or is it mainly... Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, we'd highly encourage anyone to attend. So, I don't know if I can share like links or something later with you to put in the description of the episode, but I'll definitely give info on how to keep up to date on what we're doing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to include that in the description. I'm sure our listeners will be really interested.
Yeah. Thank you.
And turning to your PhD studies, so I want to know a little bit more about your research question and what are the key sort of tensions that you might be exploring in your work, because I imagine a lot can come up when you're crossing mysticism and religion and spirituality and psychedelics. So can you lay that sort of foundation?
Kind of, because there's a complication because I had one of those classic, or that makes it seem positive, like PhD moments where I had a whole plan, I had my thesis proposal, and then I just like excavated some master's thesis that somehow had slipped under the radar, and I kind of had to start from scratch because it was so similar. That was looking at online trip reports like on Erowid and other websites, and kind of how these psychonaut communities use these forums and trip reports to develop a kind of like what I was calling a psychedelic grammar, because these experiences are so difficult to describe. And so I think a lot of times it gets, like the ineffability thing gets pushed in that it's like impossible to describe, but I think there are ways that people use language creatively, and I was kind of concerned with looking at these trip reports and how they functioned for people, what they provided to the community and to individuals, and how they serve in the development of like a shared language that we can try to piece together what's going on with these experiences. However, that was pretty much someone also had that idea. So I'm kind of shifting into the media side of things and maybe even the pop culture side of things, but it's still in a kind of like reassemblage right now where I'm kind of, feeling out the possibilities, which is exciting but kind of scary too. Yeah,
totally. It's an exciting place to be when you're still sort of formulating your ideas around a topic. Too bad that you had to start over, but it might end up being what's best for your research, so I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, and I always have the problem that a lot of people have of like, I'm just interested in so many different things, so it was actually kind of helpful that it was like, okay, this is not an option. That gives me some kind of direction away from that.
Help narrow it down. Yeah, and I want to learn a bit more about what you know about sort of religion and psychedelic context. So what are any kind of like overlaps or contrasts that you've observed between classical contemplative practices and modern psychedelic experiences in terms of things like identity or transformation or healing? I think I saw you presented on this a little bit before, specifically like around Buddhism. So I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah. The Buddhism thing was kind of like one of my entry points, because in my master's program I was interested in Taoism and Buddhism. So obviously when I started getting back into reading kind of the, popular news about psychedelics, those contemplative practices were getting brought up sometimes. And so I obviously see that there's like a resonance there for a lot of people, and there's something about the, particularly the fact that the psychedelic experience seems to open up a lot of people to exploring Buddhism, or that has like been something that's been going on since like the 60s. And so it's kind of complex, like the religion connection, though, because in my master's thesis, what I was actually really interested in was there's this whole idea of the perennial philosophy, right? So that all religions are kind of connected in some sense by some kind of common bond. And some people are saying, like, okay, all major religious traditions have a mystical tradition within it, and all of these mystical traditions are accessing the same kind of experiences. And the religions are arising out of that. That's this idea of the perennial philosophy. And in my master's thesis, I was interested in looking at how that philosophy got incorporated into the psychological study of psychedelics, particularly taking off in the 60s and with the current psychedelic renaissance, kind of like there are still, influences from that. So I was almost more concerned, sorry, because I know I'm not really getting to the overlap part. I was almost more concerned with how this kind of like perennialist thing felt like a new kind of religious movement that was forming, and a new kind of religious movement that was complicating the divide between science and religion, and that we're seeing, what I would say are like researchers as practitioners or something like that, which I don't have an issue with. I'm just observing it. And so I was interested in how religion seemed to be showing up in those research settings. As far as the overlap between these kind of traditional contemplative systems and the psychedelic experience, I think the more frameworks we have to deal with this thing, the better. And so it makes sense to me that all sorts of frameworks could resonate with this experience, because the experience itself to me is like it's like a liquid. It's going to fill up whatever framework or container is there and go beyond that even. So I don't know if that directly answers the question, but
yeah, I think it gets to a bit about how some other thinkers have thought about psychedelics as like a non-specific amplifier.
Absolutely.
They'll sort of like take the shape of the individual and their characteristics and the therapeutic context. So yeah, that makes total sense with I feel like a lot of other thoughts there. And how, if at all, do you see religious studies and that sort of overlap maybe contributing to psychedelic integration or making meaning after the experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of scholars in religious studies, particularly like here at uOttawa too, that are when they're engaging with religious studies, you're obviously encountering all these different traditions. And I think in terms of integration, that's just putting more tools in the toolkit. Mm-hmm. So I think on one hand, there's that side of it. And especially people using religious studies instrumentally for the enrichment of the degree itself, rather than like working within academia. I feel a bit separated from the integration piece, because I decided kind of early on, maybe it was more recently, that like I don't consider myself authoritative enough to really chime in on the integration thing, and I'm curious about just looking at behaviors and how people grapple with the experience and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. But I do see more and more people involved with religious studies kind of just using like I said, the kind of tools they've picked up from studying these different traditions, and then finding that those can be really useful in the integration process. And especially I think because during integration, it seems like there are a lot of things that can come up, various kinds of issues, and so you want as wide of a variety of strategies for dealing with those kind of issues as possible. And the world's religions definitely provide those kind of strategies.
Yeah. And I think since the field is becoming more clinical and neuroscientific, that sort of emphasizes like a value that keeping religious studies perspective in the conversation can have. But what are some other ways that religious studies can kind of help progress psychedelics and keeping them in the conversation? Why is that a positive thing?
Yeah, I was actually just thinking about that. I mean, the main thing to me is this, like, I think, and this might just be my perception, but I think a lot of times with like a kind of like neuroscientific approach or viewing it chemically or viewing it just in terms of like medicine or psychology, it seems like a lot of people think that will provide the answers of what these things are and what they do and how they do them, and that's like the whole picture. And to me, this is just much more complex than how can we get these to impact people's behaviors or deal with depression or things like this. It's more complex than just like a treatment. It's more complex than just something happening on a chemical level. These things don't really provide explanatory models that would be valuable to most people, I think, outside of those like scientific communities. And so so I think religious studies and all of these other kind of developing disciplines within the psychedelic humanities are extremely important, because the kind of like cultural impacts and cultural value and societal impacts of these things have really not been studied that much until recently because of the whole stigma. Also, if you look back at kind of the beginning of the Renaissance and the studies at Johns Hopkins and stuff, they were citing in some papers like old religious studies scholarship from the 60s. Like Walter Stace, for example, he was this scholar of mysticism. And those ideas have been critiqued within the field, but they just get kind of dropped in to this psychological paper on psychedelics without acknowledging that. Or actually, it is acknowledged in one of the papers, but they basically say, like, we're not going to worry about the fact that there's a debate around this because it's not relevant here. So anyways, like, the scholarship has already impacted the medical study of these things, even if it's in a subtle way. And so I think it's important to get those voices back in because there's still more to say. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I totally agree with that. And the fact that there is more than one way of knowing than just like Western medicine, I think is also kind of what you're getting at.
Absolutely. And the Western medicine piece is like important too.
Totally.
I'm really just saying like everybody should have a piece of the pie. So I agree. Like it's important to have frameworks, and maybe some that get thrown away and some that get modified, but the more people talking about this, the better, in my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, let's shift gears a bit to psychedelics and pop culture, which I think is so fascinating. You're currently writing a paper on this, is that right?
Yeah, I actually just finished it, so
okay.
That was a bit of a relief. It was fun, but it was taking a while. So
yeah. So can you give us like an overview of what that explores and maybe some specific examples of psychedelic representation in different kinds of media?
Yeah. I'm trying to, it went in a lot of different directions. I mean, the basic thing that I was focusing on was, here's what I jumped off from. There's this scholar of pop culture, like media studies scholar, John Fisk, and he had a basic intro to pop culture book, and I was kind of like, this is new territory for me, so I was like digging stuff up, and the initial chapter of this book was about like blue jeans and how people started tearing blue jeans as to signal like opposition to kind of like dominant values, opposition to capitalist values, for example. And so he had this idea that like through disfiguring like pop cultural objects, like we could consider jeans, even though that's not like media, it's still a pop cultural material object. He had this idea that disfiguring those or like distorting them in some way was how people signaled opposition. And so engaging with the popular culture that's already there, a lot of times, which is commodified, allows people to express opposition to these kind of like power structures and systems. So but then eventually after a certain period of time, you have like Calvin Klein selling torn jeans, pre-torn jeans. So it's this constant, engaging with the pop culture, maybe manipulating it on some level to signal opposition, but then that gets absorbed back into kind of the capitalist machinery, and there's this constant cycle of that. So I wanted to kind of like look at that kind of framing specifically in the context of psychedelics. So I started out in the paper by talking about like the tie-dye shirt, which worked really well because Roland Griffiths had an interview, I think, with Tim Ferriss where they were talking about he was talking with another researcher, and they basically said the word like psychedelic was beyond salvation almost, and they wanted to he specifically said like it brings to mind like tie-dye shirts and lava lamps and stuff, and we didn't want to have any association with that. So I found it very interesting that in this period we're currently in which more and more profit incentives are coming into the world of psychedelics, there's also this distancing from something like the tie-dye shirt. I think he even said like I don't want to be at a conference or present with anyone, maybe someone else said this, with anyone who's not wearing like a lab coat, basically. So I found it interesting that like all this pop culture that was associated with the psychedelic movement in the 60s was perceived as so threatening, and because of how things shook out in the 60s, there's now this movement away from that. But I also talked about how during the kind of like dark ages of psychedelics, during which there was actually all sorts of activity, really, it wasn't a dark age at all, but during this period from the 70s to like the mid-aughts, pop culture was both being absorbed by the mainstream, and psychedelics were sort of being made less threatening in certain ways. But at the same time, there were still people using psychedelics as a symbol in film or television, or music's kind of a separate thing, I feel like, but that we're still using that to express opposition to sort of mainstream values. So there was a lot going on, but it was basically about that kind of push and pull, and how pop culture was kind of like a battleground on which this grappling with the problem of psychedelics was taking place, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's not exclusive to psychedelics. Like a lot of our societal or cultural discussions and things that are current are reflected in pop culture, and people reinforce that or they challenge it, and it's sort of like almost like a way for society to like interact with these ideas on like a public scale.
Yeah, 100%. And people's readings of it and then responses to it. I mean, but I totally agree. Yeah, it's not just the psychedelic thing. And the psychedelic thing is really, because we're not talking specifically about these plants or drugs, right? Like it took on a whole life beyond just those substances. So, I mean, that's crossing over into all sorts of other issues that are also fighting their own battles in the world of pop culture. So, yeah, I agree, absolutely.
Yeah, and you mentioned the shift from like the 60s, 70s, 90s. But what about today? Like, how are those narratives kind of shifting now? And I guess they would be like reflecting current society, but also maybe shaping it. Do you have any thoughts on that in the modern kind of lens?
Yeah, and the reflecting and shaping thing like is totally what I'm always focused on. I did a paper for a class about a year ago, I guess, and I was in Ariel Fuenzalida's Sacred Plants class, and it was on sacred plants as they're portrayed in film. So I looked at kind of these 4 different films, and it was really interesting, just like the variety of ways that these plants were portrayed, and also the ways that they were used as narrative devices. So, I think for one, the range of possible portrayals kind of like exploded for a while because it was becoming less taboo. There wasn't just the drug war kind of portrayal of like these are scary and should be demonized. And it was getting more complex than like, I don't know, maybe in the 90s there would be these like stoner comedies or something where someone takes mushrooms and it's like it's just a joke. Also, I saw that like indigeneity was being portrayed and reflected in a lot of different ways. There was this really bad Western movie, like low budget kind of spaghetti Western. I think it was released under the title Blueberry. This was one of the movies I looked at for that paper, and there was a whole ayahuasca battle scene, and it was like this shaman and then this like cowboy kind of character, and they consumed ayahuasca, and then there were like these really bad 3D animations of like jaguars and snakes and stuff, and I was like, well, this is totally, like you said, like reflecting what people feel like ayahuasca is, and then reinforcing those ideas when they might not have anything to do or very, very little to do with how indigenous peoples engage with these things, you know, in reality. And so, yeah, and this is kind of shifting, but I guess looking more into the present, because now I see there's kind of that explosion during which like all these new possibilities of how psychedelics could be portrayed opened up. But now definitely I see a lot of like ayahuasca retreats and like healing of affluent white people, for example. Just like the whole idea of the retreat. I think like the engagement of some celebrities with ayahuasca, for example, kind of injected this idea into pop culture. But I don't know. Those are just a few things. Yeah, it's really a lot to get a hold on, because especially now that these things are showing up more and more in the media, there's just a lot to digest, I think.
Yeah. And I guess as a religious studies major, so you must be thinking about it from that lens a bit as well. So how do those popular representations of psychedelics maybe like borrow from or even distort traditional religious or mystical language?
Yeah, that is a good question. And to be honest with you, while I was writing the paper, I was kind of struggling to bring it back to the religion thing. I kind of got distracted, I would say. But I mean, it can manifest in a lot of ways. I saw that in the questions you sent me, you brought up like Midsommar. And I thought that was I really like that film. Actually, I taught a psychedelics and religion class at Georgia State University, and I offered extra credit for watching that film with the option to not watch it because it's not everyone's cup of tea. But
a little bit terrifying.
yeah. So I had another assignment for those that didn't want to engage in that. But I mean, I think on a religious level, that's really interesting because you have this psychedelic that is portrayed in this way, or this kind of unnamed psychedelic plant or drink that they consume. And in the context of the horror movie, first of all, that's a horror film. That's like interesting to me. But it didn't seem to be playing on the whole idea of like psychedelics make you insane or something. It seemed to be more about the sort of like religious threat of the cult or something like that. So there still is this kind of like Manson, like Charles Manson, like association of like these are brainwashing, or these are used in these kind of like cultish settings. And then trying to think about the other kind of like religious portrayals. I think one thing was that from what I could tell, and I would have to do more research, but at kind of these films at like the end of the 60s or the 70s, some of the ones that were demonizing psychedelics, it seemed like that was almost responding to a religious or spiritual threat that was posed by psychedelics, in the sense that they're a major signifier of like opposition to kind of like institutional or mainstream religion. And so I think the kind of association of psychedelics with mysticism and, like Eastern religious traditions and philosophies was sometimes portrayed in a negative light because those things were threatening to the kind of like dominant Christian values. So
yeah, it's almost like it's a tool for social cohesion in like media plot lines. So even like you said with the Charles Manson thing, like that was a bad example of that. But different cultural movements or counterculture, it sort of like brings groups together and gives them some kind of cohesion to achieve some kind of goal. So I feel like it can serve like a really interesting purpose in media in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And there a lot of times there's the opposite side of it, being portrayed as like a form of escapism, I guess. Or there's this film Altered States that was kind of based on John Lilly, who was this, he was really a dolphin researcher, but then got obsessed with LSD and then ketamine and then sensory deprivation tanks. But it was loosely based on him, and about this man kind of like withdrawing into himself and becoming totally separated from reality. And I think that just speaks to like psychedelics seem to bring up paradoxes all the time. So there's this like capacity for like social cohesion and forming community and collective healing and things like this. And then there's also the capacity for, there's like a whole slice of the Venn diagram that's like people who are into like QAnon or like far right conspiracy theories and into psychedelics, and those people are kind of like getting sucked down into a YouTube algorithm and then throwing psychedelics into that mix and kind of becoming totally separated. Yeah. So it's interesting. It has the capacity for both those, and I think both of those things have been portrayed in pop culture in different ways.
Yeah. And do you find with the escapism thing, I think that's really interesting, because I've definitely seen that before where someone has this like big experience, but it's kind of almost like the end point, and they never really like process that, or you never see the person applying that experience to like, it's almost like like an escapism kind of artwork piece in media. So did you find that as well in your research, and did you have any examples of that maybe?
I'm trying to think, because I think it depends on how I'm specifically thinking about films right now, because that was kind of what I spent the most time on. But like, how central is the filmmaker, or how central are psychedelics to the plot? How central are they to the themes of the film? Are they engaging with it like superficially or more in depth? Because I think if it's a superficial level, or again in those like stoner comedies I was mentioning in the 90s, it's a joke. It's just there for the joke. So the psychedelic trip is the end point. Like that's it doesn't need to come back up. Whereas for example, in that Altered States movie I just brought up, that's like the whole focus of the plot. And I guess I would say in that movie it's almost a kind of like anti-integration. It's like about how to completely not integrate, or integrate in a destructive way. But I do find that it's like most filmmakers, for example, that are really trying to make this a theme or a part of the film, or unpack it, oftentimes it won't be an end point, like you said. I'm trying to think of some examples off the top of my head. Maybe they'll pop in.
Yeah. Or even if it's like, like what are some of the most notable, or like your favorite sort of representations of psychedelics in the media?
Yeah. Well, I noticed again when you sent a few notes over prior to the podcast that like you had Midsommar, and then and I'm a horror movie fan, so these probably aren't the best places to see integration done in film. But you mentioned Enter the Void, and there was another film by that director called Climax, which is another psychedelic horror film, and I really like that portrayal. The film is about this team of dancers that is, I forget if it's Russia or somewhere cold, and they're rehearsing this dance routine, and then someone basically locks them all into this facility and has like spiked the whatever with LSD, and then it kind of descends into chaos after that. But the reason that I like that is not because it's so because that's what I think the psychedelic experience is or something like that. It's because it breaks free of those tropes of solely showing it as this well, I was going to say as this scary thing. The movie does portray it as scary, but it's not in a war on drugs kind of like drugs are bad kind of sense. It's more of just like a terrifying scenario. But it also doesn't totally fall into the like stereotypical mystical kind of framework. So maybe for that reason, now that I'm thinking about it, I do kind of gravitate towards the darker portrayals, but it's only because I think a lot of times those touch upon elements of the psychedelic experience that are often kind of pushed under the rug, and especially in the current state of things and how they're oftentimes treated as panaceas and that they can heal all these different conditions. I think now that I think about it, maybe I've been paying attention to the horror side of things more, because that is the reality for some people. Sometimes these things can be negative if they're not done carefully and with the integration piece. And so it just speaks to a whole side that people usually don't see. And maybe that's why I'm drawn to it.
Yeah.
It's not like I'm all doom and gloom or something.
No, that's fair. I also like appreciate media and art that is a bit more heavy and dark, and yeah, it's so true. Like psychedelics aren't a cure-all. They're not like a magic pill. There is definitely a scary door that you might go through. So I think that's super interesting. But media isn't only just for like entertainment, there's obviously also implications for society and policy. So how do you think that current media portrayals might be influencing public perceptions and policy on psychedelics? And are there like positive shifts in representation that might support like harm reduction, or do you think there are still these like harmful stereotypes that might be hindering the field?
I think the harmful stereotypes do have to still be there, but maybe in more subtle ways, because the period of sort of like prohibition versus the current state of things, there's just hasn't been enough time to collectively get rid of the subconscious energy of the negative associations with these things. But I'm kind of jumping away from that for a second. But in the paper I wrote, the last section was called like the pollinization of the flowers of perception, but it was about Michael Pollan's book How to Change Your Mind. So I feel like that was like the single most piece of, I would consider it pop culture because it's kind of a pop journalism, like the single most influential piece of kind of like pop culture that has shaped how people think about psychedelics. And what that has done, I think, is kind of intentionally or not, maybe promoted the panacea kind of perception. Actually, I don't think intentionally, if I think about it, but I think it contributed to that idea. I think it put the whole, like the fact that the clinical trials were occurring, it just brought that into public awareness. And so, and I do think it also maybe to some degree showed that there was profit to be made from these things. So that could be considered a negative. But I think the important thing is that it did open up the conversation. It did present them as less threatening. And so now we can have conversations like this. Not solely due to the book, but I feel like with all of this pop culture stuff, when people start seeing it pop up more and more, it's kind of like people are dipping their toes into the water and seeing like, oh, other people are talking about this, like, oh, this is on this show that I watch, and then it creates more opportunity for discussion. So I think if anything, it's really contributed to destigmatizing, at least having conversations about these things, which is good.
Yeah, good starting point for sure. And yeah, we're at my last question now. So just opening this up to maybe an insight for our listeners and maybe like a key takeaway from your research on psychedelics and pop culture. How do you think people should be critically engaging with these media representations? Like, do you have any tips on how to distinguish hype from substance in the media?
I mean, I think just general, like, media literacy is the main thing, which is becoming more and more complicated, just not to just develop it, but to maintain it because of how rapidly the media landscape is changing, and even with something like AI. Yeah, distinguishing between the hype or not. I mean, I think it's pretty easy in a lot of situations to tell if it's being presented in a really sensational way. If there are no negatives that are brought up from a particular spokesperson of psychedelics, for example, or if I think if the media is focusing on the healing effects and putting those first and foremost, the thing is, like, that narrative's already out there, and most people who would be reading about this stuff on their own time know that that's out there. I think I'm in my bubble, so I don't know. So I just find that, like, if there's a certain figure or piece of media that is really focused on the benefits, I become a bit skeptical, because that already is at least becoming common knowledge. So if they're focusing on that, and in my opinion it's sort of becoming common knowledge, it means they have like a narrative, a very intentional narrative. I don't know beyond that. That might be one that I have to chew on and come back to in the future or something.
Yeah, we'll have to have you back on when your thesis is all done, and we can chat about that.
Yeah, anytime. Yeah, I'd love that.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Nathan. This was super fun.
Yeah, thank you, Elena. Agreed. And yeah, happy I could make it on.
Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation with Nathan Keele-Springer. I'd like to thank the Center for Psychedelics, Health and Research at Queen's University, and the support of our sponsors at the Ontario Brain Institute, the Canadian Biomarker Integration Network in Depression, and Providence Care Hospital. Until next time, be well and integrate wisely.